moving to the north. And there were these two great patterns during which that occurred. The first migration was, like, generally speaking, that period from 1916 to 1940, when we had about 1.6 African Americans move from south to north. And then kind of around World War II, we saw the second and long migration north. And they had kind of different stories, but that played out over many years. So that's 54 years that played out over. And the reason I'm bringing that up is it kind of was a fundamental shaper of the America we see today in terms of the demographics of our country, of who is living where, of work that gets done, the types of work that unfolded in different communities. The Great Migration was a fundamental reshifting of America in that way. It's interesting when you read that book and when you read the history of all that a lot of people who were in the middle of it, they didn't even know they were in the middle of it. It wasn't like they said, we're going to join the Great Migration. It was almost like each family had a story that they ended up going where they were, but they didn't really see the big picture of this big pattern that was happening. There's some interesting things about that as well, which were like geographic patterns. So it wasn't kind of like this random people from Alabama went all over. There were very specific pipelines that happened during the first migration and the second migration about where people were going. So a lot of, you can see kind of the general pattern of the eastern seaboard from the south, kind of this area straight north into our region. My first job as a teacher was in Montgomery, Alabama. And I lived there, and lots of families there when I had moved up to Wisconsin and to this area, a lot of the same kind of geographic areas from where I first taught. So there's a lot of geographic patterns that emerged during that time. The reason I'm bringing that up is that we now are in the midst of some really significant change over the last 10 years that are kind of similar in some ways, but even more extreme in some ways than the first and second Great Migration. I want to talk about those a little bit. First of all, when people move, this is an obvious statement, kind of. When people move, the most obvious place they move is nearby. So when people move, you usually move to another neighborhood in your same community. That's the most common. Next most common is that you move, if you move out of county. So I live in Dane County. The most common move that if my family were to move, the most likely thing we would do is move to an adjacent county. So that's a very well-known pattern in migration patterns. But what other patterns are evident these recent days? Let's take a look. I want to show you just some easy visuals. I don't know how to, is there a way I can not have that up there? Oh, thank you. This is 2013 in the US. These are some of these are census data. Some are other kind of population studies. The red states in 2013 are the states that lost the most people in those years. Okay. And the blue states are the states that gained the most. So it's very obvious kind of visual. Red states, leavers, blue states, incoming, grew the most. That's 2013. Let's just see, I'm gonna go across about 9 years, see if you see a pattern. Okay, 13. I don't know why there we go, 14, 15. So if you look at the map we looked at a moment ago, it's almost the inverse in some ways. So what states do you see as the biggest receivers of migrants when you just were looking at the patterns generally? South Texas, there you go. Regional patterns of South, the most common by far, we all know this is kind of obvious stuff. I think a lot of us, Texas and Florida had massive increases of migrants coming south into Florida and Texas. California, Illinois, and New York have been losing people at the greatest rates for 10 straight years. Illinois has been the top two of losers of population. So people are pouring out of Illinois. And California last year lost over 360,000 people left the state in 1 year. So it's like, I don't know what the population of Madison is, but I don't think it's that. So in 1 year, every year they're pouring out of the state. It's just, some more numbers. The states with numeric growth, take note of where they are. The states that are getting the most people, this is last year. Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee. Now I want to get a little bit into some specific states, and we'll talk about how that, hey, Jordan, how that relates. Net migration on the right is states gained. These are the SEC conference states and the Big Ten conference states that I've included on here. So it's just the states in our conference, Big Ten, states in the SEC. And it's an obvious pattern where we see the Big Ten states highlighted on the left, the SEC states highlighted on the right, where people are going. So clearly people are going, they're moving south, they're moving out of Midwestern states, out of some of the California and New York. Some interesting sub patterns. So if you look at census data, if you look at for example, if you look at Dane County, and you think about where are people moving into last year? This is last year, Dane County. Where did the most people come in from? It's kind of like what we said at the beginning. The most common places people come from are just the neighboring counties, but also Chicago, Minneapolis, and the Detroit area are the biggest areas from outside. Chicago, the biggest outside the state. Minneapolis area, the second biggest outside the state. Where are people from Dane County who move going? It looks pretty much the same. Chicago, a lot are going to the Minneapolis area. Not so much going to Detroit, but they're pretty much staying in the state. These are the most common counties, the people who leave Dane County last year, where they went. So that's what you would expect. That's kind of like the norm. That there's also often a lot of like reciprocity in and out from a lot of places. Let's look at Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County has lost thousands and thousands of residents in recent years. And they mostly go to neighboring counties, but then there's two outliers. There's two other places in the entire country where people from Los Angeles are going to. One is the Seattle area, Kings County up in Washington. The other is Tarrant County, Texas. So just in 4 years, about 3,000 people from just Los Angeles County, not all of California, went to Tarrant County, Texas. So there are these little patterns like this where you see, just like in the Great Migration, where you'd have these partnered cities, like where I used to live in Montgomery, lots of people went to Chicago, Montgomery. There's some aspects of these patterns. One example is Los Angeles to Tarrant County, Texas. There's a lot of reasons for that. So let's look at Tarrant County. Where are people from Tarrant County coming in from? Mostly, again, from within the state. Tarrant County is like Fort Worth, is that right? We have some Texans in the house here. So the Fort Worth area, we're talking west of Dallas, a rapidly growing area. Where are people who moved into Tarrant County last year coming from? With the most common places? Los Angeles and Chicago, outside the state. So they're moving from where we saw on the map, but there's all kinds of really interesting little sub patterns like this to look at. So when we see population changes, the two big variables are migration, meaning people moved in from another place, and natural causes, which is like births and deaths. So in some places you see population change, and it's because the population is relatively stable, like Dane County, for example, relatively stable in and out. We have a slight growth, slight positive on migration, more people come in and out, but it's pretty stable. But we're getting to have an older population, more deaths potentially in these years ahead than births. And in a lot of Midwest states, you see that. You can get an interesting take when you look at school enrollment to see, like, well, what's the age of a population? All right, is it an older population, a younger population? These are, again, the Big Ten states and school enrollment, high school enrollment. High school enrollment in Big Ten states over the last 10 years. Relatively stable in all Big Ten states. So that would help, that would get us to think that, again, relatively stable age bases in these states, plus or minus 2% across most all of them. A slight, Maryland has had a little bit bigger increase in the high school population, but pretty stable. Now let's look at those same other states. And we see again, we would expect this, but with migration in are a lot of families going to these places. So Georgia is growing really quickly. Texas, 16% growth of high school students. Now let's remember this when we get back in a little bit. We start talking about implications for athletics. 16% more high school students in Texas than there were 10 years ago. In Florida, another place with huge increase, over an 8% increase in high school students. So we can see really clearly, we're setting the base for our conversation about where our athletes coming from, where they play now. Consistent, strong migration, almost the opposite of the great migration north. We're seeing people going to the south. One big difference is that we know in a lot of these data that the people who are going south are people who have economic means. So we look at that population going from Los Angeles to Tarrant County. We look at the demographics of them, or we look at the demographics of people who are moving from the Northeast down to Hillsborough County, Florida. Most of them are college educated, relatively high level SES. So they're going in with resources to these places. So there's a growing tax base in these places. There's what we call super suburbs that are emerging. So again, if our Texan natives can tell us about the super suburbs in that area, throughout Florida of communities just growing rapidly, these huge places. Let's now I think we'll see closely how these are related, but we're going to see sports participation trends. Some of them are mirror population. So as the population goes up, we would expect participation to go up if it's an even pattern. 2017-18, sports participation in high schools reached its peak in the U.S. Then it started decreasing in the pandemic. It really tanked. Now it's starting to rebound a little bit. For boys, it's not rebounding as quickly for girls. Girls are coming back to sports a little more slowly. Oh, I wanted to make you guess. I made you guess last time. All right, with people sitting by, you get 30 seconds. Guess the boys' sports in Wisconsin. Boys' sports. Let's say the four, I think that's my next slide. The four most common boys' sports, high school participation. Try to guess the four most common high school boys sports in Wisconsin right now. Get 30 seconds with your group, see if you can get it in order.
You just see it? What do you think?
Last one is girls.
Baseball? Baseball pickup?
What do you think, Marcus? Most kids play.
Track?
Not girls, just draw numbers. Draw numbers.
Track, just numbers. Or just like the highest participation.
All right, here we go. Well, I'm gonna quiz you in a moment, but I do have the girls first.
I have some from the chat
The
too.
girls' numbers first. Here are the girls' numbers. We went over this last week. Girls volleyball reigns supreme. Girls basketball is number 2 and quickly sinking. Girls soccer, softball, track. Actually, track is 2. I'm sorry. I don't know the order up there. Track is 2. Basketball going down quickly. This is I jumped the gun. These are girls' sports. We'll get to the boys in a second. But the fastest growing sports for girls right here in Wisconsin, golf and hockey are actually the only ones we've had growth in. They're the only ones we had growth in the last 10 years. The others going down the line. We did talk in depth about this last time, so I'm not going to go into those and read that. Okay. Sorry, I have the boys come up next. I forgot I want all girls and boys. All right, so part of this, what's happening is we call them partner sports. there's research on the odds that if you play one sport, that you play another sport. So if you play volleyball, we talked about your most frequent partner sport is basketball. For girls, it's the most common partner sport. For boys, for football, the most common partner sport is basketball. And secondly, baseball for football players. So these partner sports are being waged at younger ages is one thing we're seeing with girls sports. So volleyball, we learned last week, is defeating basketball soundly at young ages. It's a bad story for us basketball people, Emily, is that volleyball is kicking the butt of basketball for girls. There are less and less girls playing basketball, more and more girls playing volleyball. A couple of stories. So part of this study we've been doing is going around the country and talking to different coaches. I was talking to a coach yesterday from Lexington, Kentucky, like basketball hotbed, Lexington, Kentucky. This was a very prominent coach, someone who's seen it all. And he was telling me we were talking about this stuff. And he said, yeah, I was talking to a friend yesterday who's a basketball coach. And he was telling me all about his daughter. This is a guy in Kentucky, a basketball state. And he told me she's a freshman, but she made the varsity team. And I was congratulating her. I was saying, that is amazing. She's on the varsity team. She's only a freshman. She's in the state of Kentucky. She must be an amazing basketball player. And he said, no, actually, she's horrible. Because, she's actually a terrible basketball player, but there's no one else playing. So that's one story. Common story. And the guy said it's a little bit of a joke, but that's the truth. That's really what he said. The second story is in Kentucky, when you're in 7th grade and 8th grade, you can play on the varsity team. You're allowed to do that in the state. So there was this other story. He was talking about another girl who was like a 6'3" or 6'4" basketball player. As a 7th and 8th grader, she was on the varsity team. She was being recruited by UConn and Tennessee and all the big powerhouses. Could have gone anywhere she wanted for basketball. Ultimately, she chose to not play basketball, and she went to Kansas State to play volleyball. And she said she was tired of basketball. She was burned out on basketball. Could have gone literally anywhere. Kansas State was her only offer for volleyball. She chose volleyball. These are common stories that we're seeing in that world right now of volleyball beating basketball. That's the look of the graph we showed yesterday. Again, you can't really see it other than states that are losing in basketball, girls basketball, states that are gaining girls basketball. About 80% of states are losing girls basketball players rapidly. So girls volleyball is winning convincingly over girls basketball. These things for girls are now starting to show up at the college level. So these trends we started to see, first of all, we're getting higher and higher level athletes coming to college for girls, but also the demographics is an interesting sub point of this, which is interesting and kind of a neat story that's changing. In women's volleyball, D1, FBS, that's like Power 5, big conferences. This growth of 70.5% increase in number of Black female players over the last 10 years. That's an amazing change. In all D1, a 49% change. This is the graph. It shows the number of Black female volleyball players over the last 10 years. So some of those are trends that we started to see recently in girls volleyball going into the South, girls volleyball coming other places. We're starting to see at the college level. Okay. Now we're back to our boys quiz. What was the number one sport you all agreed upon? Easy answer for boys in Wisconsin.
What did we say?
Easy answer.
Football.
Football. If you just look at the sideline, how many football is number one? What do you think is number two?
Track.
One says track.
You play hockey in high school here?
Yes, they play hockey. Hockey. Any other guesses? Basketball. Okay. All right. In Wisconsin, by far, football is the biggest participatory sport. Don't get tricked by the top. So this is, sorry, the colors are hard. That's football. This is basketball. Just nudged ahead of track. This is track. This is baseball. This is in the state of Wisconsin.
You said baseball.
All right. And these are the other sports. Soccer is next up. Wrestling, cross country, golf, tennis, hockey, and swimming. These are boys playing on high school teams in Wisconsin over the last 10 years. This is a heat map of the changes, the percentage changes in boys sports over the last 10 years. Soccer, boys soccer is the fastest growing sport in high school in the state of Wisconsin. I'll talk about some of those other changes here in a minute. So this is our state, what we're seeing. These are nationally the sports that are growing the quickest. Volleyball, both boys and girls. Actually, boys volleyball is shooting up really quick. The numbers are low, but percentage of change is really, really high. Soccer and flag football is a very interesting story. I won't get into today, but flag football numbers are growing for both boys and girls at the high school level. Now, the soccer story is one that, so we have these different data sources, one of which is a really interesting data source, which is SFIA. I talked about this last week. Sports Fitness Industry Association. And that data is data that you have to, really expensive, it's very, very protective of it. You have to buy it. We bought it just to see it for the first year. It shows these really interesting things about playing patterns outside of school, inside of school at different levels. And so the one thing that jumps out more than anything from the SFIA data is the sport of soccer. And we'll talk about it for a couple of reasons why. Those data and some other data suggest an explosion of soccer here in the next 10 years. If there's one sport to put your money on, if you had to like monetize, like you want to get into the business, this is one that people are going to be flocking to for a number of reasons. First of all, it's the only team sport that's been growing in our state and other states throughout. Of all team sports, it's the only one that's growing in each of the last 3 years. The shifting demographics, some of the stuff we're looking at, if you look at our country and who is coming into our country, if you look at the demographics of where people are living and where sports are the biggest, there's a very significant soccer population that's growing rapidly. So the people who are coming into the U.S. and people who are getting more active in the U.S. are soccer, a lot of Latino populations, a lot of people who live in areas of the country where soccer is the number one sport. It's growing quickly. I won't get into this hugely right now, but for years, there was an obvious story about how U.S. men's soccer really struggled. And a lot of that was because college was the main pipeline for, like, if you were a young soccer player, your big goal as a young soccer player was to get a scholarship to UW-Madison or to get a scholarship to, UCLA or wherever to go play soccer. In the last couple of years, the U.S. has kind of adopted the European model where we have a lot of academies developing soccer academies, MLS soccer academies and others, where some of the top talent is starting to go into. So that has had all kinds of effects, but one is to have increased participation from traditionally marginalized communities in soccer. It's a story in of itself that we could have another seminar. We won't today, so that will affect stuff. There's really interesting literature. If you look at when big events are held, especially the last two there, 2026 World Cup, 2028 LA Summer Olympics. It's kind of like the shadow effects of big events on games. And if you look at that, where the Olympics have happened in other places, when the World Cup has happened in other places, the immediate participation and commercial effects of that. If you take the things on the last slide, with these things happening all in the US in the next 5 years, these will all be what we call kind of soccer accelerators. And they're all happening. This has never happened that all of these have happened at the same time. So soccer will be on our radar very significantly. The growth of the Major League Soccer in the US has been exponential. In 2 years, MLS franchises will be valued at more than NHL franchises, which is a really interesting development. All that relates to the growth of soccer. So that's one sport to keep your eye on. What sports are trending downward? Won't get names, but these are the 5 biggest downward trends in terms of participation. But be careful I say that, because football is never been more popular in terms of viewership, in terms of like the NFL, big college football from fans. But in terms of participation, These five sports have lost the most over the last 5 years, percentage wise. So let's talk about football. Like I said, social popularity of football, if you look at all kinds of metrics, never been higher, never been greater. Super Bowl, college football playoff, high school football in a lot of places in Texas and a lot of places never been more popular than it is. But the numbers of participation, I think a lot of you know these numbers, but they are really interesting. They're very different depending where you look. So it's a little eye-opening, I think, if you look at those differences. This is from the SFIH. This is like the industry report we talked about. So first of all, we explain a couple of these. When we talk about who is playing football, first of all, the segment of who actually is playing football, you look at these two things combined, that's 90% of football players are right there between ages 6 and 17. So 60% of football players are high school. So football, more than almost any other sport, is really, football participation is really more concentrated in this very narrow demographic of males who are in high school. Very different if you look at the basketball numbers, because people play league basketball until they're in their 50s and 60s. People play volleyball, people play golf, tennis. They have these long age spans. Football is this very narrow age of participation. Of course, there are the 2% who make it to the pros. There are 6% who play in college, but it's a really interesting variable about football. Another thing is that the demographics of the racial demographics of who is represented in it. African Americans are disproportionately represented in football. So much this little this index versus total population, basically the higher it is, it shows how proportionate it is to your general representation in society. So like if African Americans make up 10% of the population in general, and they make up 10% of the population who plays football, it would be a 100. It's the same. So as this number gets higher, it shows a higher representation. So what you see here is that white people are underrepresented in playing football as related proportionally to how many they make up in the society, and black people are overrepresented. Let's look at some trends in high school football in Big Ten states. I'm not going to go through all this. The state of Indiana lost 11%, Ohio, Minnesota, Illinois. High school football participation over 10 years. No, I'm sorry, this is over 15 years. We wanted to, about 15 to 17. We wanted to look at, all right, we have a kid who's a high school recruit right now, like 16 years old. What's the sport look like since he was born? How has it changed? This is how it's changed in all of these states. Each has a story that's different. I'm going kind of quickly through them. Let's look at them. That's what jumps out when you look at the Big Ten states and high school football, is that every state in the Big Ten has lost players in football. There's again, this is not like something that's shocking to a lot of us. We've known this is the case, that less kids are playing football. It also has, like, on one hand, you could say, well, football is dying, but like we said, in some communities, we know it's never been better. We know that in like popularity in some places, it's never been better. But these kind of macro patterns are, especially when you look down at some of these states in the bottom. Michigan
Is 30.
has lost a third of its football players in 15 years. This is a significant change. Different changes by region. This is the SEC states. How has it changed in those states? It's doing the other way. It's going up. More kids are playing in these states. Alabama is one of the things that, like, when the Nick Saban effect, it's not just Nick Saban, it's a lot of things. There's a cultural thing about football there. Again, when I used to teach in Alabama, it was like the mid 90s, late 90s. Football is huge, but it's only grown since then. Versus it's not done that in other states in terms of how many kids are playing. So these numbers are very interesting to see, both in terms of percent change, but also in terms of, you look at the raw numbers of how many kids are playing football in Texas. 170,000 kids are playing high school football in Texas. So then that's like the raw number. The other term we've really been studying a bit is sport density, meaning what that would mean is like Texas has 170,000 boys playing football. But it's a huge state. There's way more people living in Texas than here. So just because there's a raw number, what does that mean in terms of like the density of how many people play it? So we want to look at what states have like low density, high density in these sports. Sorry, this is a little bit, I was just crunching these numbers this morning. So it's not looking real pretty yet, but this is the percent of, this column is the number of boys playing football in each state. This column is the number of boys enrolled in public and private high schools in that state. This is the percent of boys who play football in each state. So the higher the percent shows the higher proportion of boys who play football in each state. So even though Wisconsin, for example, we saw that our numbers have gone down kind of precipitously, we still have one of the highest participation rates in our state of all Big Ten states. Over 15% of high school boys are playing high school football. So it's still like a really significant population. But California has this huge number, 90,000 almost, but not as high of a density rate. So a lot kind of proportionally fewer per 100 playing football. I can't see because of the bottom, but I think this number on the bottom,
11%.
11%, on average, about 11% of boys in Big Ten states play football. Okay, SEC states, it says we expect a higher percentage, especially we see like Alabama, a third of boys play football. It's unbelievable if you really think about that. And Mississippi, 37%. So these are definitely dense football states. It's happening there a lot. So, yeah.
This is the money. So Mississippi has 37% of high school age boys play football.
Yep.
37% of those boys who play high school sport.
No, it's all high school boys. So these are the number playing the sport of football. These are the total number of boys in high school. So those are kind of jaw-dropping, actually incredible numbers. If you can think of that, 37% of all boys play football in these states. So it's an indicator of a culture of football, like the cultural factor that we're going to get into here in a minute, which is only accelerating in a lot of these states. Now, so we looked at demographic trends, like where are people going? The thing I should have said here is that when we look at those trends of growth and the numbers in those states, in some states like Texas, the percent of population growth is actually pretty similar to the percent of football growth. So it's kind of what you expect, like the density, sport density has remained relatively constant. So thousands of people are flooding in from Los Angeles and other places, but still about the same percent of boys are playing football. In other states, like Alabama has experienced a little bit of a population growth over the last 10 years, but an explosion in popularity of football. So you have both a little bit of a population growth, but also a higher percentage of those who are there playing. So some little differences there. Okay, I got one more interactive activity real quick. I always do this with our Hugh just walked in and he probably has experienced this. When we coach the basketball teams together, I always try to get the girls or boys to communicate better. Like Gerardo and I always try to do that, get them talk. And so one of the activities I always do like the first day is I say, okay, girls, get lined up by birthday. So January 1st is the front of the line. December 31st is the end of the line. You get in line, you have 30 seconds to get in line by, earliest in the calendar year to last in the calendar year. All right, so at your table right now, let's see if you can get an order of your birthday in 30 seconds. No years, just the birthday. 30 seconds. Okay, all right. Oh, you guys were pretty quick. Okay, I'm only gonna test one group. let's test this group. What's the birth dates? Read off your birthday.
Yeah, here, October 16th.
October 21st.
October 22nd.
Okay, so let's look at this group very quickly. Say it again.
April 7th,
April.
September 17th.
right.
October.
Now, there's an April birthday, which is if you let's break down the calendar year into quarters. Okay, the first we can all sit down now. I just need to I mean, saying I should have had prizes. The first quarter of the birth year, Jackie, you're a hockey family. Bridget, you're a hockey family. Why would it be likely? Huh?
Very important.
Why is that important for a hockey family?
Because
That you're in the first quarter of the year.
you can actually hear in the.
Okay, so this is what we call so right now our next section, we're going to talk about the cultivation of, like we talked about patterns, now about like how are people like cultivating talent throughout our country. I'm talking about a couple different things, but one is what we call the relative age effect that a lot of people are paying attention to in all these different regions, a lot of different places. Relative age effect, which Jackie just mentioned, like in hockey, to my understanding, and it is this way in soccer, it is this way in baseball, it can be in basketball, but basketball a little less so. If you're born on January 1st of 2007, you're playing on the 2017, right, for your club. If you're born on December 31st of 2007, you're on the same team, but you're a year older. So when Jackie is 8, 9, 10, she's probably gonna be better than me born on December 31st because of maturity, size. It may have nothing to do with her skill set. She's just bigger. She's like, that's something that's very, very well known. So that actually is a thing. It's funny, there's some funny articles about it, about hockey families and how they aim to conceive children and when. And that's a very like actual thing that occurs. All right. And there's studies, there are all kinds of studies about NHL players and how higher proportion of them are born in January, February, March than the other years because it starts early, it snowballs. So Jackie gets picked for that elite team when she's 8. She gets the best coach. She gets the best rink time. She gets confident. She gets built up, and it just snowballs. And then poor me, born on December 31, I made the C team, and I'm smaller. I'm getting beat up, and before you know it, like that snowballs, right? And that's been found to be a really, I'm sure you've read some of that, but a really significant factor. It actually is a factor in sport, and it's most a factor the younger you are. Okay, so like if you're talking 12-year-olds, the relative age effect is a major thing. Just because Tracy's on the 18, it may have nothing to do with Tracy being better than Maria, but because he's a little older, he got on the 18. As we get up to like age 18 or 20, that effect is diminished a bit. But the reason it's so relevant is because as specialization in all of our sports there's a downward pressure in specialization, meaning kids are choosing one sport, volleyball or basketball, soccer over softball, whatever it is at younger ages. Marcus, you have to stop playing basketball now if you want to have a chance, to really make it in football. And kids are doing that at higher rates. And when they do that, they're usually doing it as this plays out in a very strong way. Just because I was better at something at age 12 doesn't mean I'll be better at that at age 18. And the same thing happens with recruiting, is that as we start having a downward pressure with recruiting, the younger we recruit, the more we'll be deceived by the relative age effect. In fact, just as in school, like I was talking with Lindsay about this yesterday. She's a psychologist, my wife, and she has the early childhood research on education. A lot of people redshirt their kids because they think that ultimately, if my son will do better if he's the oldest one in the grade, ultimately down the line. There's research that shows that sometimes there's a flip effect of some of that. That by nature of being the underdog when you're young, like in sports, we could say like the younger one. Kids learn all kinds of things like how to adapt. They learn skills instead of just overpowering other kids. They learn to be resilient. when they're younger, they're going to be creative athletes as opposed to just, again, being faster or stronger. And then ultimately, when they do blossom, the late bloomers end up being even better than the early bloomers. So the interesting thing in a lot of these studies is you'll find is that even though there's a higher proportion of, for example, NHL players who are born the first quarter of the year, if you look at the truly elite NHL players, the ones who were like the Hall of Famers, there's a disproportionate amount of them born at the end of the year. So to try to make sense of that, which is that they had longer odds to get to the league. The odds were against them to get there. But for those who did make it, their odds were better to be the best. This is a factor that's playing out in a lot of our communities. You can think about that, the impacts of that. But it's a blind spot for a lot of our communities right now. We talk about cultivating athletes, which is that we try to get the best teams, we try to get the best athletes at U8, U9, U10, U11, U12, and we're completely not paying attention to the relative age effect, which is that a lot of kids, where we call the late bloomers, end up actually being the most physically gifted in these sports. So that's one line of work that has implications, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Gotta get through this. The other is there's this whole literature out here on the geography of talent development, meaning like age matters, but so does space. Like where you grow up matters on your odds of making it, of your odds of developing. Your physical surroundings, your home, your community, all those things. So let's look at a little bit of that. There's a lot of articles, these are just a couple of these articles. This one's called Place, Not Date of Birth, Influences Development, Emergence of Athletic Talent in American Football. So in football, relative age effect is way less, it's not even found to be a significant variable because the most important football traditionally has come at the high school level. So it's not been a club pathway, it's been a school pathway. So just because I was an underdeveloped 12th or 10th grader doesn't mean that by the time I'm in 11th and 12th grade, when my body finally comes into its own, that I could make it. So in football, we don't see the relative age effect as much as we do in the other sports, but we do see bigger effects on place as a big thing. Place matters more in football than just about any other sport. One is like size of town. This is an interesting one, I thought, which is that if you look at the NFL and major college football, small cities are overwhelmingly represented where they're from. So way more kids come from small towns proportionately than from big cities. Talk about this more in a minute. A lot of reasons for that. Think about, well, I had a bunch of pictures of Texas in here about different Texas stadiums. But I had too many slides, so I pulled them out. But a lot of things, one is like access to the sport. If you're in a small town, think about your access to a sport. And we're not talking about rural counties here. Some areas that are rural places actually have no good access. They're too far from everything. Small towns traditionally have access to resources, good facilities, and then the other is there's this term here called conservative cultivation, and that's been a really strong theme in the education research for the last 10 years. So which means that when you get the right people on board together, when you have parents, schools, and communities who are kind of working in concert with each other, not meaning they're always getting along, but they're kind of like on the same page, they understand each other, they share resources together. You have way better odds. Again, not shocking, but it's a very profound thing in the education literature and more so in the athletic literature coming up of making it. In small towns, this concerted cultivation, small towns in Texas especially, we could talk about, and some emerging places in Florida, it happens naturally. It happens very naturally, more so than a lot of other places that we could learn about as well. So a big part of this is socioeconomic status. A lot of those places that have a lot of money, kids have every access to every resource. Of course, that's an advantage, but it's not the only one. Some of these places that are growing, I'll talk about that for a second. Like in Texas, we were just talking before. You're nearby your home. You're Dallas County. You were in Dallas County.
Collin County, but yeah.
Collin County. You look at these counties in Texas. You look at the socioeconomic characteristic. This is the average home value in Carroll Independent School District. Is that South Lake Carroll High School? If you heard about South Lake Carroll in Texas, it's like this Texas powerhouse. There are a lot of these that have this place, 30% of the homes are worth $1 million or more. This is one of these places that's receiving all kinds of people coming in. They're building these houses. They're not moving into high-rise apartment complexes. They're moving into $1 million houses. 57% of homes in that school district are worth between $500,000 and $1 million. Why is that relevant? The price of homes.
Status.
Status and tax. There's like this tax. There's this tax base, and there's and it's an indicator of who is there. Yeah, tax base is significant. Median household income in this school district is $334,000. Median income. This is not this is an economic outlier. This is one of the highest earning counties, but these places are places that when we saw the great migration north, we were going into industrial jobs, people working in factories in the cities, living in very difficult situations. This last 10-year migration are people moving long distances to places, many of them places of affluence, affluent school districts. We call these super suburbs, and we know from our work and from a lot of others that they're the most efficient cultivators and prolific producers of college athletes. When I say efficient, it's kind of like the example we've used is the Jamaican sprinters you talked about last week, which is like they don't miss. They don't miss anybody. If you grow up in Jamaica, that you start, again, we share this example, there's a lot been written about this. They start taking sprinting classes in kindergarten. It's in the public school curriculum. Every single student learns how to run and learns the stride, and it's done. That's what PE class, a big part of PE class is. So immediately kids are screened and they're found and they're cultivated. No one misses. That's why every Olympics you'll see Jamaican sprinters from this tiny little country. They don't miss. They don't miss talent. A lot of our emerging super suburbs have little cases of that, where just because Arrowhead produces the most Big Ten athletes in our state, Arrowhead High School, just an hour or so to our east, produces the most Big Ten athletes in our state. Is it that kids in Arrowhead are better than no, it's that it's part of this. It's part of the resources, first of all, that they have. They have great coaching, they have great facilities, they have all that. They also don't miss as much. They don't miss on the kids that come through. A lot of kids come through there, they're from the young ages, they're being cultivated in that way. These other school districts are the other main producers of Big Ten athletes. And we each know about these places, I'm sure in deep ways. These are the places that are producing the most right now. Look at Wisconsin, our state, then, and the implications of what we're talking about. Those areas in blue, we know that a lot of our top athletes are coming from these places. These are kind of affluent suburbs in some cases. We would expect that in the next 10 years, these areas are growing still. They're growing in lots of ways. Their schools are growing, their communities are growing. They will continue to be the main producers. So the question then is how do we draw from those places, but also how do we increase access in other places where diminishing participation is occurring? We'll talk about that in a minute as we wrap up. So what are the implications for all kinds of things? When I say recruiting and access, I mean those. I'll explain how I mean those. So recruiting mean like, well, where would we think talent will be? Where would we think we should look if we're looking for great talent? Access meaning more of an equity thing, like how do we ensure that we get broader swaths of kids access to good opportunities, to concerted cultivation, not just to kind of random programs. Those are two questions that are related, but slightly different. The football story has some insight for other sports. One is that an implication of this, an implication of the migration trends of who's living where, an implication of the participation trends for recruiting is that we know that there's a strong regional advantage. For example, if you look at, I'll look at this here. This is just one random example, but we looked at a lot of different examples. Like last year, you could take any recruiting database you want. We just showed this one public one. 74 of the top 2023 football, 74 of the top 100 recruits signed with an in-state or adjacent state school. So in-state would mean you signed with a school in your state, or an adjacent state mean a state that is adjacent. So it's a regional signing. You're from Texas, you sign with a school in Texas or in Oklahoma. You're from Illinois, you sign with a school in Illinois or in Wisconsin or Indiana, adjacent state. So football, more so than a lot of sports, still has a really strong regional recruiting pattern in it. And this is actually interesting because when we first started looking at football rosters, you can look at an overall roster and you can see, wow, that's a really, our Wisconsin roster is tons of Wisconsin kids. It can be back heavy in that a lot of kids who are like walk-ons or who are a lot of walk-ons. Football has a heavy walk-on number. Also, it has kids who are not blue chippers who are most always regional. So, every recruiting class may have its 4 stars, 5 stars, 3 stars, but every recruiting class is going to have some kids who are not that. Most of those kids who are not that are regional recruits in football and in other sports. So what I'm getting at is that football rosters are almost always regional, but this is the group that we would think would be more national would be the high recruits. So if Q's the 5th rated quarterback in the country and he lives in California, he can go anywhere he wants. He's a 5th rated recruit. But we still see, even for that type of recruit, he's disproportionately choosing to stay close to home. This is one example. The top 100 of the top 100 players in this database in 2024, we have 35. I think my math report is 51. More than half of them are from Texas, Florida, or Georgia. So that's a regional. The point there is that changes in participation are important at state levels. We know that. But even more so at regional levels, what we mean is that, like, just because the state of Wisconsin has decreasing numbers of kids playing, that's like concerning in some ways in terms of us finding talent in Wisconsin. But what's even more concerning is when you look at the numbers in Minnesota, in Iowa, in Illinois, in Michigan, like all of our areas right around us, they're all going down. So that's what we're seeing in some areas, these football deserts, we could call them, meaning like the game in terms of participation is decreasing. So how do we think about building the game, not just kind of looking at the top numbers, but looking at grassroots participation, building it up. This is kind of what we've been talking about. One warning sign for a lot of communities like the ones in Texas and even some of our larger, as we wrap up, are a relative age effect. In some of these places, we were talking about some of these schools in Texas that have 5, 6, 7,000 students in them. They're getting like this elite talent, but there's a whole lot of kids who are not getting access there because of how big the schools are. So in a lot of these growing communities, they will be producing great talent, but they also are losing a lot of kids to the relative age effect because at young ages, kids are weeding themselves out. So that's something to think about as well. Last 2 slides. How we cultivate talent has changed. We always talked about how great it is for kids, like in basketball, to just get out of the playground, just play. That's not the way kids are developed anymore. We can talk about that was better back then, or that whatever. It's not the way. That's not the path anymore. The kids are having specialized services. They have specialized trainers, psychologists, nutritionists, all of these things. So how we cultivate athletes has dramatically changed, and we have to think about how, in that world, do we get access to a broader swath of kids? Because we're losing a lot of kids because of the way that's happened. This last thing in the middle is a little bit random, but there's really, in our coaching research, we've found a lot of things, but it's kind of a couple of big studies recently have found like what makes a relationship successful. with a coach and a player, actually even between any people, what makes my relationship with Jonah go well? And one of the biggest findings of this recent study in psychology is that Jonah feeling known by me is the biggest indicator that he will view our relationship as successful. If he feels that I know him, not that he knows me, but that I know him, he will perceive our relationship to be successful. So a lot of these small towns are doing that really well. A lot of kids are feeling known. A lot of kids who come up in a small town feel known by a coach who's known them since they were 10. They feel known by parents. They feel known by the parents of friends, all of those people. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of bigger communities are facing is a lot of kids who do not feel known. And so it seems like such an abstract thing, but it's a big deal. Like, how do you get kids to feel known from the time they're at a certain age and bring them up feeling known as people, not just as a football player who's really good at 10 because he's big. Back to Wisconsin, key challenges continue to increase access to kids in lots of areas of cultivation, and not just in these suburbs, but all throughout. I shared this with a couple of you yesterday. There's some really interesting possibilities, like with partnerships in Dallas right now. What the Dallas Stars are doing is developing. They're developing these massive youth sports complexes throughout the state of Texas, using their resources and using it both for talent development, but also for kind of access for more kids. So there are possibilities that I think every state could look at is how do we partner with kind of our big entities to get access for more kids, not only for like the good of so that more kids can play, but also for talent development. How do you develop talent in a more efficient way? So that is a lot of stuff. Before we wrap up, does anybody have any questions or comments? What any reactions?
In the middle of like going through all this research, I can understand the access piece being a big deal. Did you see or hear anything around like understanding mindset of a kid leading to how they are successful? Part of my Texas bias would be like there are a lot of kids in these places that have a lot of resources. So they might get access to college, but it doesn't mean they're going to be successful because they've been catered to and like they have indoors that are better than our indoor and all this sort of see research along the way that suggests to me better.
The closest thing that I think of, Marcus, is two things. One, with regard to the relative age effect. The biggest sub-variable at play there is self-efficacy. Is that kids who are made to feel really good about themselves when they're 10, 11, 12, they build confidence and self-efficacy at a young age. And so a lot of that is kind of artificial in that, like, just because, Morgan can hit a ball way farther when she's 10, she starts feeling really good about her mindset becomes, I'm the best at a young age. And that is a long-term effect. And so one is that how do you get kids who are not on that spectrum to kind of stay in it, stick in it so you can develop a better mindset. The other is like when we look at why kids are quitting sports, there's three variables. They're the three biggest variables of why kids are quitting. One is cost. So they can't afford it because the pathway now is club sports, professional, all that stuff, the professionalization cost. Second is burnout because they have kind of just like the volleyball story, the girl who got burned out on basketball and chose volleyball. The third is coaching, and that coaches who have no idea what they're doing, and coaches who are negative. We talk about this a lot, Tracy, about coaches who are destructive influences on kids. So mindset of kids is deeply affected by coaches as well. So that's one I think, that's what we're trying to work on with our leadership work is get coaches who know what they're talking about, are positive, developing youth mindset. Any other questions or reactions?
Have you seen an increase in reclassifying because of the labor effect?
We haven't looked at, I have not looked at that, Gerardo, the data on reclassifiers, but
The kid was developing, so you're seeing that reclassification happening more often.
The most interesting thing to me looking at that issue, not of reclassifying, but the relative age effect, is the blind spot of so many key people, like parents not realizing it, understanding it, coaches and clubs not understanding it. So by the time it gets to that reclassification decision, they're almost stepping back and reassessing every decision they made earlier. So I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, other than I haven't looked into the numbers of that. But a lot of parents probably choose the wrong sport for their kids if they would hang in there. One of the lessons is try to hang in there with multiple sports as long as you can. You know, you may have a son who you think is a great basketball player when he's whatever 10, but by the time he's 18, maybe he should have been playing golf or something. Yeah, so
Research in the US, I know, I think in voting classes, that Denmark doesn't have that component after 12 years of age. You look at all, like, what is that look like after 12 years of age, for these don't force that, well, they, people that not be part of the community, but not working.
I haven't not studied the international setting as much. I have seen some really interesting things, like in Australian football. There are examples of how they do not cluster kids by age before 12, but by size. So you could be 150-pound 8-year-old, and you're going to be playing with the 150-pound 11-year-old. And they pair. It's an interesting thing, but they pair by size. They want a bunch of like-sized kids to play with each other, so they're all developing everything. It's got some interesting. So I've seen models like that. I've seen models like, yeah, like the lack of competitive clubs before those ages, because more recreational play models, which are very appealing. Our problem that will never happen here because of the money in the club sports. The people who are making so much money off it will not go back, unfortunately. But there are things like local school districts could do to recognize that and to keep kids in the game. That's the thing that's so troubling, is that so often we pay all our attention to that top team when they're 10. You know, we give all those kids all the attention when they're young, and we're not only putting too much pressure on those kids, but we're losing this huge swath of kids who, even if they don't become late bloomers, it's like, it's just not right that you're doing that at age 10 and 11 with kids who should be given due attention, should be known, as we were saying.
This
Well-
STARS facility, is it just hockey, or are they putting?
This is, no, that's a great question. They're hockey, but then hockey have been some of their main facilities, but basketball, volleyball, softball, these are numerous facilities throughout Texas. And they're like, this is just an article last week. The Stars are investing, and the Mavs are about to invest, and then professional volleyball there. So there's a really good like vertical integration there that I think is a model that a lot of states should look into, which is like linking from the professional and high level college downward. Major League Baseball is doing that. I went out and visited a couple of those academies, the Compton Academy and some other places. They're doing that pretty well. Major League Soccer is doing it real well, developing these academies. I think there's lots of room for the NBA to do it better, for the NFL to do it better. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. It's great to have you here, and I'm happy to talk about this stuff more. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete.
Probably a little bit